Hey guys, last time I left you jokers, I was on the spindle sander, spindle sanding the transition between my shoulder and also my handle. And I did one and then left you guys when I did the other one. And I said we would go over to the router table where we'll round this over, actually bullnose it. The problem is I lied again. There's something on this spindle sander that I wanted to show you, something that you should know. And it's really, really important that you're able to do this because a lot of times if I'm working with somebody in the shop somewhere else, if you could change this spindle to a different size spindle, you'd help out your cause an awful lot. So I wanted to show you how I can do that, and I can do it pretty quickly. If you look at this spindle sander, you'll notice that right here, there's 5 different size spindles. I also have ones in the back. There's a bunch of spindles back here, and all of them will fit certain sizes. If you look at the size that I needed when I was sanding my transition, obviously I couldn't use something that's 3 inches wide. I needed about a 7/8 or a 1-inch spindle. This is a spindle that we use quite often, but a lot of times we'll use a spindle like this. And again, if I'm working with somebody else, it's really difficult for me to come over here and to do a spindle transition change. Certainly something that you can do. So let's get at this. The first common mistake that people make is they see a nut up top and they want to take this nut off. Truth of the matter is we want to leave all the nuts that are on top of the spindle exactly where they are. I'm going to pop off this throat plate, very similar to a throat plate that you have on the table saw. And if you take a look down here, you'll notice that there's a nut on the spindle, and this is part of the spindle, and there's a nut that's located on the armature of the machinery. What we want to do is we want to hold this bottom nut exactly where it is. We want to take the top nut that's on the spindle, and all of them have a nut on the bottom of their spindles. We want to take this nut and we want to loosen it up. To loosen it up, we're going to use 2 wrenches. And we always want to make sure we loosen that nut in what direction? I know, lefty, loosey, righty, tighty. Yep, but what does that mean? Nothing. It doesn't mean anything. Everybody can say it and nobody knows what it means. I don't want you to think of it that way. I want you to think of it as if you're looking at that clock. You want to loosen something up counterclockwise, tighten things up clockwise. In other words, if I look down at this nut, that nut on the spindle has to go counterclockwise in order to loosen up. Located on the back side of this are 2 wrenches, 2 open-end wrenches. One, a bigger, heavier one, which has a wrench on both ends, 2 open-end wrenches. This one will fit over top of the nut that's on the armature. The smaller wrench, with only a box end and an open-end wrench, will fit on the spindle. So now what I want to do is I want to take the spindle and I want to move it counterclockwise or towards that window. If you notice, when I loosened it up, I didn't struggle. I gripped my teeth, I turned it, and this actually came out pretty easy. I'm going to unscrew this, and I'm going to put the larger spindle in to show you an issue that you might have. So here's my spindle, there's the nut. I place it into the spindle sander, and I'm going to turn this, which direction? Clockwise to tighten. So I tighten it clockwise, and now I'm left with an issue. When this spindle was in here, I could see both the spindle nut and I could see the armature nut. Now I can't see it because of the size of this drum. So what I'm going to do is take the spindle nut wrench and kind of feel for it. So I can't see it, but I can kind of feel that I'm on there, and I'm going to tighten this. Watch my face when I tighten this. Look. And that's it. I'm not going like this. I'm not straining. All I want to do is snug it. Once I snug it, that's it. If I make this too tight, So many times, and it usually happens with this spindle, people tighten this down too much, and of course we can never get it off. So I just need it snug. Once it's snug in place, of course this throat plate won't fit anymore. So you're going to use the wooden throat plate located in the back, which will drop directly down over top of the spindle sander. And now you're all set to work with the larger drum. If you look, you want to choose the drum that is the largest available that will fit, but not too big. So I wouldn't use this on my handle because it's way too big. And this one was even too big. It was close, but it was too big. That's why I went with this spindle. So the largest possible that won't make the diameter of the curve too big, okay? So we did with this. I made good on a lie. Now we'll go over to the old router table and make this thing into a cheese board. Walk this way. And this is pretty simple, always the coolest thing. The question today is, why does he have a router table and not just a handheld router? The truth of the matter is, this router table saves us so much time. Because if we were to use a handheld router, what you would have to do is take the board, clamp it down to the table, hold on to the handheld router, route until I got to the clamp, loosen up the clamp, turn it over, route it more, move the clamp. By using the router table, it's actually much safer too, because we're able to operate this as if we were operating the table saw. To do this, I'm routing this end, this edge, and this handle, and I'm going to save the handle for last. When I do this, I want to make sure that I understand, anytime you route a board, you always want to route the end grain first. So if I'm routing ends and edges, always do the ends first, because if it ever chips, even though this is rounded, there's a chance that it probably won't chip. But if it chips on the end when I go back over and I route on the edge, I will usually clean up that chip. So going back to this, why do I have the router table as opposed to handheld router? Number one, it's safer. Number two, it's quicker. So those will be your answers. Which board do you want me to route? Bigger one, smaller one? Bigger one again? Okay, fine, no problem. I have set a rounding over bit onto this router table. The rounding over bit looks like this, which means it's an edge cutting bit. It has a ball bearing and it has the shape. If you look at that shape, I have the bit set so the table is exactly the same height as the curve of that bit. So when it routes, it's not going to route and leave a lip from the bit. It will be exactly rounded. We want to bullnose this. In other words, there are several router shapes that I could make with this. If I just wanted to route a little bit, I can break the edge. In other words, this edge is sharp. Ow, jeez. It's sharp. So I want to get rid of this sharp edge because it's not nice to touch. I could set it so I just break it a little bit. If I break it a little, I round this over, and instead of spending 5.5 weeks sanding, I can get it done in about 9 seconds. So breaking the edge allows me to have a nice smooth edge, and it takes the sharpness off. The other thing that I could do is I could round it over. On this particular board, I set the radius to be deeper. I rounded this over and I broke this back edge. This is something that you would use if you were making one of the short tables. The rounded over part would go on the outside, the larger radius, and the smaller radius on the inside. By far and away, our most popular shape is bullnosing, and that's what I'm going to do to my cheese boards. When I bullnose this, it's going to give me a complete rounded over on the top and also on the bottom. It will feel nice and smooth and rounded. It becomes more touchable. So that's what I'm going to do to this. I set the bit to that distance. The other thing that I did as sort of like a little safety is to set the fence. Even though I'm using a bit that has a ball bearing, I set the fence to make sure that I'm routing it almost like I'm working off of the table saw. So when I do this, I'm going to do this end first, and I'm going to do these edges. Then I'll do the curves, and then lastly, I'm going to do the handles. Then I'm ready to sand the whole project. Whenever I route on this, always sleeves are up, safety glasses on. I always want to stand slightly off to the left-hand side. When I do this, the board is large enough where I can operate it with my hand. If it's small, I could always use a push stick. This is one of those pieces of equipment, after I see you operate, if I feel as though you look comfortable on this, I'll say, hey, you can do this by yourself. But always get supervision before, or just ask or tell me you're going to use this. I'll look at you cut. If I feel comfortable with it, I'll give you the okay, and it's all yours. I never want to come in contact with the bit, so my finger will never go up against the fence. My hands are always going to be off to the side. Any questions? No? Okay, let's do it. I'm going to start the machine. Do the end first. Just like I'm working on the table saw, two thumbs, back in, and I'm going to route. So you look at what I had, and now what I have, and you notice that this is rounded over. I'll flip it around, I'll do the same thing for the opposite end. If you notice when I do this, I keep my hands away. Not routing, routing. And this will all just get sanded over and blended in. I'll do the end on my shorter board. I'm keeping pressure down as I go across here. And again, there's some things that you just have to be strong with. So that feels a heck of a lot better than it did before. Now I'm going to do the edges. Same exact way. And I'll flip it over. Keeping pressure down as I go. There are my edges. I have a little bit of a burn mark. I don't know if that was in there before. These corners still look a little shoddy. So I'll go back over there and I'll route these after I do the other side. Pressure down. Pressure down. I was going to say pressure down, but I didn't. So if I look at this, the end is rounded over, the edge is rounded over, but these corners are a little funky. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a stand to the left-hand side of this, and I'm going to show you how you could just spin this and route this by pivoting this on the router table, similar to the way I pivoted it when I was sanding. I'll take a step over here, you'll take a step over there. Again, I'm going to use the handle as my guide, and I'll actually just pivot the handle. I want to make sure that this part goes up against the ball bearing, and I'll just spin it along. When I do the top side, I'll flip it over this way, hold on to the handle, and spin it this way. So I'm going to pick up this edge, turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it. So when I do this, it will round that over. It usually burns on one side. I'll flip it over, and I'll pick up this end now, hold on to the handle. board 2, same way. Pick up the edge. Pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it. If I want, I can move on to this side. Pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it. Flip it over, pick up the edge. Turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it. Go right across the end. When I get to this end, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it, pivot it. Done. So this is a nice, smooth transition. It's super touchable now. Really feels good. The last part is the tricky part, which happens to be the handle. On the handle, I'm not going to use the fence. So I'm going to take the fence out of the equation and get into some things that if you've never experienced, you have no idea what I'm talking about. If I mention to you about kickback on this router table, I've done it 100 times. When it happens, you're like, whoa, what just happened? So much of it has to do with where the bit comes in contact with the wood. If I were to take this handle and stick it right in here, I guarantee that this bit would take this board and shoot it back at that wall. I don't like that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to stand where I was routing the corners. I'm going to pick up this board. I'm going to route, zip around, and come out this other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand off to the side where I don't think the board would ever kick back. To do that, I clear off my fence. And this is one of those operations where I really don't feel comfortable with any student doing this. So if you want, you could do the ends, you could do the edges. But when it comes to this handle, unless you're like super talented and you know exactly what's happening, I'll take care of this because it's definitely the trickiest and also probably the most dangerous part. So I'm going to say a prayer, little prayer here, okay. I'm going to start it so that my hands are away from the router table. Lift my fingers so I have a little friction. I'm going to pick up this edge and I'm going to go in. Route. You can't fake steak. I've heard that one. It's one of those things that when you start routing, if that router, and it's like a dog, like the surfacer, if it senses you're afraid, it'll eat you alive. So when you come over here, you go, I'm going to route you. I'm going to be in control of this. You can't hold on to it like you're afraid. That's why I'm doing it and not you, okay? Again, not to undercut your knowledge, but just to understand how it works. And there's definitely a mindset when it comes to certain operations in woodworking. I'll do the other side of the handle. Pick up the edge. Keep coming, 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 keep coming. Ha! So if you look at this, I now have a very touchable handle. Feel it, cameraman. Is that touchable or what? That's a like. Yeah, that's a heck of a lot better than the way I started today. You're going to say to me, hey, Shimko, you got some burn marks here? Nothing that a little abrasive paper can't handle. This is done. I'm going to move on to my larger one. I'll finish this. And then I can move on to the mundane aspect of sanding, which I know everyone loves to do. I'm going to pick it up the same way. I'm going to own this. I'm going to house this. I'm going to make this thing look good. Classic, clean, concentration. Pick up the edge. Route it. Come on. be one of the biggest cheese boards I ever routed. I don't think I was ready for that. Same thing, I transitioned well, I got to this point. There's definitely stress on this bit. This bit's been on here for a bit. You notice some burn marks. After I finish this, I'll probably change that bit and get rid of it and put a new bit on. But I do want to finish this side. After I finish this side, I'll be all set. Same thing.
Great, get in the mindset.
What's that?
Get in the mindset.
I'm in the mood. No. Fixated here.
Focus.
I'll pick up an egg and I'll round. Come on. Turn it, 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 come on, come on, come on. Ha! Wow.
Aces.
I got through that. That's a big handle. That's a big board right there. You could use this as a pizza peel, I guess, if you want. But if you look again, I have my burn marks. I'll clean this up. After I clean this up, and I'm only going to show you a small section because I know we've talked about this. We're going to take a walk over to the old vise where I'll start to clean this up. But for the most part, I have two really good looking cheese boards. And I haven't even sanded, haven't even finished it, but they feel a lot better than they started today. Let's walk over to the vise. This is the same vise that I used to scrape. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the vise to sand my board. And someone said to me, is there a sequence? Oh, absolutely. Again, I said everything happens here for a reason, which means if you think ahead, you're going to save yourself a heck of a lot of work. What I want to do is I want to start with the roughest grit abrasive paper that I have. In this case, every piece of abrasive paper has a number on it. This happens to be a piece of 80 grit, which means, and the only way I could think about this and keep this straight in my mind, is imagine this to be a square inch. The manufacturer is telling you that there's 80 grits in 1 inch. Here's a piece of 120 grit, which is 120 grits in that same 1 inch area. If I take a look at another piece of paper, bump, 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 bump. I think it's this one. Nope, I lied. Hope it's this one. Yes. There is a God. I have some 220 grit paper. So imagine a square inch, 220 grits in that 1 inch. Another one, 400 grit. Another one, 600 grit. So my question to you is, which one is coarser? Which is the coarsest abrasive paper we use? Is it 600, 400, 220, 120, or 80? The answer is, the lower the number, the coarser the grit. Imagine this piece of paper to be 2 grit. It's 2 stones on the piece of paper. So I imagine this to be 80, not saying that if you count all those abrasives on there, the size of it dictates that it's 80 grits. So I'm going to start off with my roughest grit abrasive paper. When I start with 80 grit, I'm also going to start sanding the end grain. And this is hugely important. I've talked to you guys about this a lot. Whenever I start the end grain first, I never ever want to take the abrasive paper and wrap it around and sand the surface of my board. Because the big thing you never ever want to do is go against the surface. I'm going to take the abrasive paper and I'm going to start to sand this end grain. And people say, you're going against the grain. Well, I'm really not, because end grain can be sanded in any direction. I don't know anybody who would sand it this way. It's so much easier just to grab a piece of paper and go at it. So as I sand this, The one thing I'm not doing is wrapping my abrasive paper and making scratches across the surface because I'd have to get those out. So if you look at what I'm doing here, I want to take my burn marks out and I want to sand this end grain until you don't see any scratches and you see nothing but the growth rings on this board. So as I look at this, and this is a great piece to look at, is the piece of oak or that piece of ash, you'll notice that I see no saw marks and I see nothing but growth rings. The next grit that I want to move up to is 120 grit. But before I go into 120 and finish off this end with all the other pieces, an interesting thing often happens. People take 80 grit, they wrap it around their board, and they start to sand, and if you notice, it's not making contact on the very top end of the board. So they'll get something that looks really great on either side. They'll get a white line in the middle. If you get a white line in the middle, and they go from 80 grit to 120 grit to 220 grit to 400 grit, and that white line stays in there, the only way to get that white line out is to go back to a piece of 80 grit or 120. I tell people all the time, and this is your second question, what grit do you want to sand the most with? And the answer is 80 grit. Fall in love with 80. Because when I sand with 600 grit, you're going to think that that's magical. The truth of the matter is that if I didn't get my marks out with 80, you'd be looking at smooth marks. And you'd say that looks awful with a piece of 600 grit. So with 80 grit, I want to make sure I take care of this all together. I got some marks in here. Some burn marks. I'll probably get, shut up, cameraman. Everybody's a critic now. People say, oh, I can get away with those burn marks. No, it looks lousy. It looks cheap. Looks like you don't know what's going on. So there's my 80 grit. Now I'm going to move on to 120 grit. Here's another trick that I have. Abrasive paper. So many times, somebody will ask me for a piece of abrasive. Of course, that's a bad one. And that's a bad one. Oh boy, oh boy. If you're going to use this to hand sand, what I always like to do is I'm going to fold it, not lengthwise, widthwise. I heard this one from a bunch of little kids. They said, you folded hot dog or you folded hamburger. I never heard that when I was growing up. I'm going to make this the short way, fold it, tear it, and something as stupid as, how do I start to sand with this? I'm going to take this abrasive paper, I'm going to fold it into thirds. And the reason why I'm going to do that, so many people will take a piece of abrasive paper, fold it in half. I start to sand with this, and it's paper on paper. When I sand that way, the paper will just slide and it'll tear. If I fold it into thirds, I have abrasive on paper. And if I do that, this paper isn't going to go anywhere and it'll last you a lot longer. So whenever you're sanding with a piece of abrasive and you're going to cut it and fold it, always fold it into thirds if you're using it to hand sand, and it'll probably last a little bit longer. So here's my end grain. I'm now sanding this with 120 grit. And the thing that you should notice is that I sanded this a heck of a lot less with 120 grit than I sanded with 80 grit. And that's going to be your transition. The most with 80, the next most with 120. Now I go on to 220. And when you sand with 220, this is the abrasive paper that usually puts a shine. It'll make the grain stand out. And this is what everybody touches and they go, ooh, oh, yeah, ouch. This paper's thin. So when you sand with this and you really work up a head of steam, I could burn my hand on this. So be careful with 220 grit, 400 grit, and 600 grit. Only because I care, 400 grit, fold it in on itself. And again, less with 400 than I did 220. And my final piece is 600 grit. I'm going to tell you, you could stop at 220, but if you do a great job and you sand anything with 600 grit, you will never sand it less on anything else again. Maple is an incredible wood to sand. If you sand it with 600 grit, it'll feel as soft as a kitten's ear.
Pretty soft.
Pretty soft. So there's my 600 grit. So I want to feel if I did a nice job with that. Whoa, holy Hannah. Absolutely perfect. If you notice, take a look at that. I hope cameraman can get a shot of this actually shining. There's a shine to that. Imagine that across this entire cheese board. If you make a project this good and you give it to somebody, it's nothing but hugs and kisses when you finish a project like this. I'm gonna leave you with sanding this. The next time I pick this up, I'm gonna drill a hole in the center. I'll also use the drill press when I do that, and I'll put a leather strap on this that'll really dress it up. But the next time I talk to you, I'll be able to finish this up and maybe start on another project. You guys have a great evening. See you soon.